if you'd
Yeah,
like.
well, actually, that takes us really nicely onto Oscar's question, because Oscar wants to know about what are the key kind of principles to bear in mind when designing a second edition of a game. And also we had another question from Mari, which is what are the main themes and qualities that you wanted to keep the same, and what did you want to develop or change? And it seems like that's part of what you were talking about there, what was core to it and what you might want to change.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean the game itself, the original game itself is a product of its time. Essentially, what you're doing is as I mentioned earlier, you're playing as a character and you're moving around the Dracula's castle alongside everyone else who's playing the game, and the aim is to be the last surviving player. And you can get knocked out of the game in various ways. The castle can do for you, or you can pick up weapons you can use to eliminate other players and that kind of thing. So to me, that was essentially that's the original in a nutshell. There's all sorts of things you can do in it, obviously, but the first thing I wanted to do was to try and actually identify what the spirit of the original actually looked like for me. So I made notes. It was the player elimination aspect. It was about being the last player standing. It had to be set in Dracula's castle, and the theme had to go along with that. So for me, virtually anything else was fair game. But those things I just wasn't prepared to compromise on whatsoever. So take, for example, the kind of roll to move element from the original. Moving around the castle is just one way of interacting with players, one way of getting from room to room. It's one way of getting around. As I say, whether that was done with dice, or whether it was done in another way, I was open to changing those things. So. But to me, it was about recognizing and identifying what those core things were. So once you know what those things are, so take for example the player elimination. It's a mechanic that's incredibly unpopular these days with large swathes of the board game community. So what I wanted to do, rather than take it out, it was to reduce the frustrations around why people don't like it. So it was sort of in that spirit, and it kind of one thing led on to the other. So, for example, with the player elimination, generally speaking, most people I think don't mind being eliminated from a game. It is the waiting that they have a major problem with. So straight away that led me to the decision that we needed to speed the game up, and that became a core tenet of what it was we were looking to do. So all the changes that we've made to the game have been about speeding it up as much as possible. So that is essentially the main thing. We also looked at building on the theme, developing the theme, and the other thing was to try and give players more choices, because I think that's one of the most important changes or differences between games from a fairly long time ago to modern games. You want to give players as much opportunity to interact with one another as possible, and so they were the three things that we really tried to focus on in terms of modernizing it, but again not compromising on what those initial things were that we wanted to keep in place.
I think I'll jump in briefly here. Because there's an interesting discussion around like drawing battle lines to me. Like it feels like what you have to do as a designer is you start by doing your research and you discover, like you said, Kris, exactly what it is that you really love about the game and what you feel is important. And then you sort of have to draw these lines in the sand and say, these are the things that I'm holding as the key tenets that I'm working toward. You define what those things are, and then you discover and look at why those things are important to you. So you talk about how co-op games are increasingly popular. So then you have to look through the lens of, so why is player elimination important for this? Like you look at the why for those things, so that then you're able to generate some kind of direction that you move in, rather than just copying somebody else's. And the question specifically looks at how do you stay true to that? Kris, I wonder if maybe you be worth covering not only your research into the game so that you knew what you were staying true to, but also your discussions with Robert, the original designer. That might be of interest to people.
Yeah, sure. So Robert, there's quite an interesting story behind the game. So Robert Wynne-Simmons, if I just mentioned that briefly. So Robert Wynne-Simmons created the game alongside Nigel Andrews, and they were basically friends. They went to school together, and they created this game, as I say, in 1966. And to their knowledge, it was the first horror board game. They're not aware of any horror board games that preceded that, and
because it was pre-Board Game Geek.
and they, that was the entire reason that they created it, was because they loved horror, and they wanted to play a horror board game, but there wasn't one available, so they made one themselves. And for a long time, they played on handmade boards that were distributed through their friends. And then obviously in 1992, it got published, and it became popular with a certain generation of board gamers who look back on it very fondly today. So in terms of the conversations that I had with Robert, I got in touch with him, and he'd spoken to a few people in the past, I've since found out, about bringing this game back to life, as it were. And they'd never proceeded for one reason or another. But I personally found Robert to be incredibly open and supportive around any changes to the game. There were certain things that he wouldn't want to see changed or compromised in any way, because he's very proud of what they created all that time ago, and rightly so. And so I think, when I explained to him that I didn't want to change these things, which perhaps a different publisher may have done, I think that gave him confidence, in moving forwards with myself. And I've kept in touch with Robert and Nigel, and throughout the whole process, I've kept them up to date. But in the spirit, like Robert made it very clear at the beginning, he was happy to be very hands-off, and that I could take it however I wanted to. So I felt like he's put a lot of trust and faith in me. And I actually got to meet him at the last, not the digital version of Spiel, but the actual one we had in 2019, I think it was. I got to meet him there, which was lovely, and he's a really great guy. But he's actually done some interesting things as well. I don't know if you know this, Devon. We were talking earlier about folk horror, and you were saying you're a big fan of it. He actually wrote the script for Blood on Satan's Crawl, which is one of the unholy trinity, of folk horror movies. So lots of interesting stories and interesting people. Nigel, actually, he was a prominent film critic, and worked for a long time for the Financial Times as their lead film critic. So yeah, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful experience to be able to have, and to be able to bring together those two visions, yours and his, of what the game is and what it could be. And I really liked as well your earlier comments about looking at what those core parts of the game are. I mean, there are some games that you think of, and the first thing you think of with them is that they are visually stunning. There are other games where you think of the intricate mechanics, and others where it's the theme that comes to mind. So being able to pull apart what that specific core part of that game is a really great way to go about focusing on how you reform it. And I think it sounds like from discussions there that you had somebody who had a really strong area with narrative in there. So that theme was obviously a really strong one to be able to use and to be able to bring into the current day gaming industry.
Yeah, for sure.